ladies and gentlemen, was Forspoken. When Forspoken initially came out, I was always interested in the game. The gameplay seemed unique as there was emphasis on fast-paced parkour movement, with the game creating combat of spell casting. A lot of games to me, and this has always been the mindset when going into games, because simply of how I was raised in a certain generation of gaming, is that if the gameplay is good, the game is good. Simple as that. I notice some people, if the story is not great, it creates less incentive for you to move forward for whatever reason, which is completely valid, especially since we are in a generation where AAA games have big stories inserted to these games, whether you like it or not. Now, I do have a big criticism about how stories are more focused than video games themselves, which is a topic for another day, but it does somewhat involve Forspoken when it comes to these standards. I generally do believe that this is a solid game for what it is. I also believe that the story is not awfully cringy to consume compared to what many people have said. This game has always been clowned for what it is with its dialogue and viral clips, but as someone who could care less about the story, I was actually intrigued with the direction it went. The setup for this game is basically an isekai. If you don't know what an isekai is, it's a Japanese subgenre in fiction where a character gets magically transported to another world. As much as it does sound a bit cheesy, it works well for it being a video game storyline, which is why we have some fun dialogue coming from Frey, which are the clips you have been seeing online for what everyone has been making fun of.
I just moved with my freaking mind!
Although these clips may seem not as well for certain people, I do think they tap into Frey's character well on an emotional level, as she is a young woman being homeless in New York, as she was revealed that she is an orphan who lives by herself in an abandoned building. Her comedic timing is more so a coping mechanism whenever things start to be heavy on her, as many things start to dwindle down for our main character. Getting through the entire story really made me realize no matter what world she is in, she is a magnet for bad things to happen. At some point, you start to really feel bad for Frey and the many things she has gone through. I was honestly surprised how the story was written, and it was definitely a dark fantasy game, and the only bright side of it all was Frey. I was happy that I was able to experience this since my expectations were a bit different coming into the story, and the plot twist of the Cuff, you know, the other character that the internet got annoyed with or cringed about. There are much more revelations to that character and its lore, which is why it makes sense why people were annoyed with him initially. I also found the little world building interesting since they had archives of documents about places or characters throughout the open world map. It got repetitive, and I would even argue that the documents helped carry the game's narrative to make the story more compelling. Although, I always felt rewarded when finding these archives since it helped give more details on the main plot. I think they could have found a better way of showcasing the lore than making players find them constantly. I was about to say that they could have showcased the lore better by inserting them in side quests, but at that point in the game, when you are exploring, 90% of the world is pretty much wiped out by a plague called the Break. I do generally feel that the writers kind of cornered themselves, as there was not much content when progressing through the middle of the game. I'll get into that when I talk about the gameplay, but the pacing is weird to say the least. It's honestly best to keep beelining the main story quest, since a lot of gameplay features are locked behind these quests. Ironically, the best part of this game is actually once you complete it. Yeah, you could still enjoy the game when you're right in the middle of the story, since you have a good amount of skills to traverse with, and just to enjoy the gameplay loop, but my goodness, the amount of skills and spellcasting combos you can do by post-game against these mob fights or even boss fights are really fun to engage with. What's also quite interesting about post-game content in Forspoken is that there's still some bits of story to go through, which usually a lot of AAA games don't tend to do nowadays. It's usually once the credits hit, you're done, but they took the time to add bits of the story for the characters, and it helped create more polished up conclusions of their own story arcs. Not everything in post-game story is as intriguing, but I just thought I should put it out there because clearly there was still effort being put upon by the end of the game. So to recap my thoughts on the story, it had its ups and downs with the direction it was taking with. You're gonna love some parts, the other half it's really whatever to you. I still don't think it was as bad of what everyone has said it would be. It did a great job expressing the emotion of these characters and its storyline. I also did think the story can be predictable. It's just that once you get near the ending of the game, things really do start to be interesting with the plot. But like I said before, it wrote itself in a corner where they weren't able to create a fun atmosphere throughout the main story quest, and this is the issue I see of why people haven't given it a chance. I also want to put out that I did play the DLC. This is somewhat of an expansion for the story, which I even found more interesting than the base game itself. It revealed a lot of what we have learned throughout the base game, and they have added upon it, which created surprising results. By the end of it, I was really put off guard how well the DLC was for me. Also, they did change up their gameplay and level design, which I will talk about later. Spoiler alert, they clearly know how to create good boss fights and enemies. Overall, the DLC was a sleeper hit, and I enjoyed it as soon as I was able to obtain all abilities and was able to sync in with the story. Now let's discuss map design. They have created a wonderful map where you could run and do some parkour moves. You really feel free with the movement you have. I know some people have criticized the open world for it being an empty map, but for the most part I understand why the map looked the way it did. It's simply because of its lore, but has functionality for the player to do acrobatic stunts, freely move around these areas, and involve all these together for its combat when you're out in the field fighting these mobs or bosses. The biggest problem of this game is how they gatekept your abilities to traverse, along with not completing content you want to do initially due to how you are underleveled for a certain part of the map. It's a bit contradictory of the game to do that when it's one of the main issues from the past where people have expressed that the point of an open world map is for players to do what they want to do. Forspoken doesn't clearly do that since there are required traversal abilities for you to access certain locations as Frey travels across Athia. As a completionist when it comes to video games, it really bothered me that I couldn't go to these locations on spot just because I didn't have a grappling hook ability yet, or I didn't have enough jumps to go to a certain location. Things like that, where the game didn't want you to push the parkour aspect, which is the core value of Forspoken. Regardless of them making their open world semi-linear due to the story, that's where the main issue lies. The more you progress with the story, the more abilities are obtained. As much as that is a normal way to obtain abilities in any RPG, I felt that some abilities should have been given to us at the start or given us a way to obtain it as soon as you start to travel in the open world map. Another solution to this is how the map design shouldn't be so egregious with high level expectations when first setting out. There could have been many ways to handle this, but progression was very linear when it comes to ability growth. There are so many cool abilities or skills to discover and utilize. It would have been great to actually add these abilities within the open world so players can feel more incentive to roam around and engage with the content. I'm not gonna lie with you guys, the open world content is very repetitive and it wouldn't seem as fun to everyone if the gameplay doesn't click with them. I only stayed around with this game mainly due to how ambitious the combat seemed, and I'm glad I continued playing. But I also understand why some people backed out of the first few hours or so, because just like any RPG, it is very slow to get into, especially how you can't do as much in the open world until you get into the middle of the game, which was about 10 plus hours of my playtime already. I do want to clarify that it took that amount of time because I was still trying to roam around the map and do its content, figure out how the game flows and everything, but I think people can progress way faster than me if they actually try to beeline the story, which is why I recommend newcomers to do that. I also have to remind you guys, it's still an action RPG game, so you may have to do some grinding and upgrades along the way for your gear. I honestly felt that I never really grinded for the game, since I was thoroughly enjoying the combat and gameplay loop. The side content in the open world is quick to do, so it doesn't hurt to complete certain landmarks or tasks when free roaming. Now, back to discussing a few more flaws about its map design. As you progress with beginning of the story, Frey sets out to a big journey where you do a big amount of traveling. What I previously mentioned of how you couldn't access certain locations since you didn't have certain traversal abilities, this situation also creates less incentive for players to go back and complete them. You don't necessarily backtrack to any location as you progress the game. The only place you tend to go back to is the main hub area that they established and introduced to you at the beginning of the game. Another issue that I found is how the map doesn't push your parkour skills. What I love about the recent Spider-Man games, especially Spider-Man 2, is how I never bothered to use the fast travel feature. I always enjoyed swinging around doing tricks, and I even turn off the swing assist to have a better understanding of the movement and swinging Spider-Man does. It was much more difficult as soon as I turned off that setting, but I I always felt rewarded for learning and gaining much more skill as I traversed as Spider-Man. Having this knowledge felt immersive but useful in combat situations. Creating these layers in video games is what creates this passive engagement to the player. Forspoken surely has these moments on utilizing the parkour traversal system correctly, and I found myself not using their fast travel feature most of the time. I always enjoyed how I approached the map as Frey when doing cool parkour stunts, but I felt that there should have been more places in this map where you can push Frey's parkour skill to the limit, like having more creative ways to platform to a certain location, having more environmental objects to leverage with, and things of that nature than just running around and jumping. They clearly had areas where it was more daring than casually jumping around and swinging, but the difference with Spider-Man and Forspoken is that New York is a playground for Spider-Man to do cool swings and tricks of that nature, while Athia is just a place for Frey to get through. There are many things where I felt the game was held back, which I will discuss later, but this was one of the main things I really crave for when roaming around as Frey. I really loved how this game implemented parkour for you to roam around in this big open world while having this core element as your main combat system. I don't think there has been a AAA game in recent years that does that. It's just that the game felt short in terms of its map, while the writing didn't help it at all when their abilities were locked behind the story. Despite my criticisms for certain designs of this game, the biggest quality for this game is how unique the combat can be. A lot of people have criticized its gameplay for being boring since you're just shooting rocks at enemies, but clearly the game is more than what meets the eye. As I mentioned before, players have not progressed as far enough to even see how other spells operate. There are many spells to cast, and there are about 4 different spell styles. All are different elements that react differently towards enemies and how you play as Frey. This honestly creates its own stylistic combat system, as you're able to switch spell styles on the go, making it very similar to Devil May Cry's style stances. They also have a grading system every time you get into combat, and higher the grade you have, the more XP and items you will obtain after defeating enemies or bosses. This is a bit of an incentive for players to combo correctly in each fight so they could earn their rewards. It's surprisingly a very stylish game to play, with the amount of flashiness with animations of parkour to its combat. Clearly this game wants you to sauce up against these bosses and other enemy types, which I'm all here for. There's actually quite a depth for each layer of spells that are given to you, and you could be creative by combining all these spells, as you're able to switch fluidly by swiping a direction on your touchpad or accessing a wheel to select what spell style you want to go with. If you're not really into these type of games, which are doing all these cool moves and styling on the enemy, this game is not gonna be any better for you. Character action games or games that embrace style require time and knowledge for you to flow with the game properly. Since we are also on this topic, I would like to bring up that the difficulty in this game was okay for the most part. I did play on normal. I did hear the hardest difficulty ain't as different, which is why I never bothered putting up the difficulty. I also don't expect a Souls-like difficulty, and that's completely fine. These type of games don't necessarily need that. Their purpose is for the player to be immersed in stylistic gameplay, and the objective is to be cool. When I first played this demo before the game launched, I was completely shocked how ambitious their gameplay was. So once I had all the spells that I was comfortable with and got into the combat in the full game, doing some parkour moves while casting spells really felt sweet to do. It had that power fantasy feel as I was doing cool trick combos on the enemy. Ironically, this game felt more fun to play with its gameplay than Final Fantasy 16 because they focus a lot of its gameplay loop in the world you're in. People can feel however they want about the Ubisoft design in this open world where you go to these places for gear or experience. It works when you have good gameplay behind it. Funny enough, since this is the team that created F15, which was not the best FF game at all, I think we could all agree on that. When I initially played that game 2 years after its release, when they pretty much fixed up and polished the game with its current updates in that time, I found myself being quite addicted on exploring 15's world and enjoying what the gameplay is. Although I had my gripes with how they approached their combat system and the world map, I was still enjoying it and nearly 100%ing the game by the end of my first playthrough. This was sort of the case for Forspoken. I don't know why I have been enjoying games from this team where I clearly know that the game struggles on certain things in a fundamental level in combat, which usually for any game is a strong game breaker. I guess this team just knows how to create fun. They continue to impress me despite the backlashes they had from the internet about their games. They clearly know how to captivate what games usually don't bother to do, which is gameplay. I know that sounds ridiculous, but there are many AAA games that are way too focused on its narrative than them improving the gameplay or what creates a fun and functional video game. As much as I loved Final Fantasy XVI, whether we are talking about its story or combat, the game for me just didn't reach the highs of what I expected to have, which weren't high expectations at all. Final Fantasy XVI was one of my top anticipated video games simply because of a Final Fantasy game having Devil May Cry combat mechanics, which is a match made in heaven for me. So of course, coming into F16, I was thrilled to buy the game and keep on playing it. Little did I know that 16 was not that game where I could thoroughly enjoy the gameplay simply because there was barely gameplay to begin with. Don't get me wrong, the combat was beautiful along with amazing boss fights. It's just that I wanted more than just sitting around and watching the story continuously unfold. It came to the point where I wasn't as engaged. The game didn't get better when there was pretty much nothing to really grind for or no big gameplay loop in between story quests. It was very linear for gameplay and it had basically an auto progression where the right leveled or upgrade gear is already prepared for you as you progress throughout the game. All I really wanted was more activities to do involving its combat. I also wanted to grind out the game in some sort of way. I understand why the team made these decisions for 16 since Yoshi P has clarified that they wanted the players to finish their game rather than quitting because they noticed that players get exhausted when grinding too much. I also felt that they should have created a system or gameplay loop where you can grind out for your gear that doesn't take up too much of your time. I could go on about issues I personally had about 16, but I brought this up because Forspoken offers features of what I wanted in 16, which is hilarious considering the reputation between these games. Now, what Forspoken does is of course offer the gameplay loop and grind factor. It's not too demanding of your time, but it's also entertaining to do if you enjoy the combat, and I found myself always getting addicted to completing each zone of the map, whether it seemed repetitive. I enjoyed leveling up and improving my spells in the skill tree, along with collecting new gear that can offer new playstyles for me. There was actual layered systems created in this game since this is an action RPG. I wouldn't say it's very heavy on the RPG mechanics, but compared to Final Fantasy XVI, there was clearly systems to utilize in Forspoken to get an upper advantage in combat. Although F16 is labeled as an action RPG, a lot of RPG mechanics are held back or not even used. It's more so a very straightforward action game that is like Devil May Cry. What's very technical of 16 was the combo mechanics you can do. Enemies didn't have weaknesses or exploits to focus on, while Forspoken had these features. Free roaming or fighting against certain enemy types, you are obligated to switch of what spell type you have equipped since you wouldn't be doing as much damage. I would still say that Forspoken isn't the most eccentric action RPG. It's very light on its RPG mechanics, but it's also present in its gameplay where it is utilized. They even have a grading system included like Devil May Cry, giving incentive for players to combo or fight better to obtain rewards passively. I found it surprising that 16 didn't have this in their main story, but they have it in their arcade mode. Not that it was necessarily needed, but it would have been a nice feature to have along with its story mode, especially as an indicator for newcomers to improve in their combat mechanics. It's also important to note that this isn't a huge thing for Forspoken to include this grading system, because if it was ripped off from its game entirely, it wouldn't make a big difference. It's how the small details or features that are presented in this game have actual purpose. Although these games are different, they are very similar with how they present gameplay and being stylish. As much as Forspoken is inferior with the world map and its content compared to Final Fantasy 15, from what I last remember from playing 15 is that the combat wasn't all that great. Forspoken is clearly a game that the team has heavily improved upon for its overall gameplay combat. As much as this was a big improvement for the Luminous Studio team compared to their last video game release of 15, of course there are some issues that still underlie Forspoken. The mind-boggling criticisms I had of 15 was the majority of its combat. Although 15 was a whole new change for Final Fantasy, and finally switching over from turn-based combat to action or live combat, it didn't necessarily feel like an action game due to its controls. Alongside animations feeling floaty or have delay to them, creating unresponsive controls and clunkiness. Overall, the game felt that it needed improvements within its combat system. It's safe to say that Forspoken is a refined version of FF15's combat and has resolved many issues I initially had, but controls and the feel of the game sometimes tend to not feel natural within its combat. The lack of not having a dodge roll or not able to fluidly move around while casting spells is a really missed opportunity. The game clearly has a dodge roll, but it is removed once you have the parkour ability. I did look into its settings if there was a way to rebind the controls where I could dodge roll with circle and do parkour running with the left stick, but unfortunately it's not a thing. I really think a dodge roll will help create these fights feel natural because Frey just kind of strafes around when casting spells. You are able to still run in parkour, but there is barely any other attack animations for doing dash attacks or running around, which forces you to walk or strafe around enemies. It's kind of weird because parkour still exists in combat. You're able to parkour around enemy attacks or projectiles, which help you evade and create openings for you to cast spells in the air or for you to reposition in the fight. The problem is that you don't have as much air combat in this game, which is also another missed opportunity, especially how Frey is consistently in the air for the amount of time she's in when fighting many mobs or bosses. These are the things I mean where it is questionable on why this is not present in the fight, where clearly this game would encourage these type of things within its combat. So to summarize everything, the game just pushes you to be in the ground more, which is not a problem. It's just that with how enemy behavior is, there are many off-screen attacks, there are many enemies running towards you, and all the aggro is taken upon you. I do want to add as well that one of the resolutions to this to prevent off-screen attacks is changing the FOV in combat, because I also found myself always trying to track down the enemy, and the FOV can be too close to Frey rather than focusing on the area you are in. It does get very overwhelming from time to time, but as I mentioned before, it would have been nice to have a dodge roll to move efficiently on the ground rather than just strafing around enemies, while also having the option to have more parkour attacks, running around and spellcasting these mobs or bosses. The game would have really felt great if they added these mechanics. With how we just talked about the controls and feel of the combat, there are times where it does feel unresponsive, very similar to how I felt about FF15. Since there are so many animations for certain things during combat, it is a detriment because as many things are happening, I don't see what's actually going on with so many effects on screen. The mobs attacking and trying to execute combos. Things just don't do the inputs I want to do. I found this very recurring as well when I try to evade enemy attacks. The parkour dash you do to evade is one of the most completely useless animations in this game. I don't even know why this was present for its combat, since a lot of movement is binded to the circle button on the PlayStation controller. My initial reaction is to dodge, of course, by pressing circle. If you press it once, you initiate a very short dash, and Frey does not go anywhere in the area. If you want to efficiently evade, you would have to hold the circle button to initiate the parkour movement, so there's still a risk if you want to evade immediately, which is why having a dodge roll feature is so recommended for the developers to do. This was the issue I had with 15, where they made the circle button the combat button. If you wanted to do attacks with Noctis, you would need to hold circle the entire time and they would auto combat the enemies. Things would have been much simpler and reasonable if they just made their button controls react to the input than just holding it. It's funny because when initiating to combat the enemies in Forspoken, they resolved that issue. But now the newest problem is when holding circle to evade rather than just simply pressing it. Again, mind-boggling design when it comes to how their controls work. I could be completely on this assessment, and it's just a very inconsistent mechanic, but the game would feel much better if things were polished up on this. Another issue I have with the control layout is spell switching. Now, this isn't as big of an issue compared to the holding circle to evade or the lack of a dodge roll. It would have benefited the game quite nicely if the smooth spell switching wasn't relied on the touchpad. I would much preferably have the spell switching bind to the directional pads to something very similar like Devil May Cry because of how convenient the control layout was. Now, to be fair, they did add a weapon wheel system where you're able to switch spells anytime you want with the combat, but it's just better to do combos and switch on the go seamlessly without any menus popping out. A minor issue is how the weapon wheel is. This more so is a me thing. I don't know if this really affects anyone else, but I always have a difficult time switching to certain support spells and primary spells during combat. We are always in fast-paced scenarios and I always have certain things in mind on what spells to cast. Every time I use this weapon wheel that they have for the spells, they always inaccurately choose the wrong ones, and that's more so the problem on my end, trying to just quickly make the input to my liking, but situations like this make me not enjoy how the weapon wheel is. I do want to note that depending which spell you want to use, you could use your left or right bumper controller and it will cycle through the spells. It's just that I much prefer immediately picking the spell I want than just cycling through it. It would be nice if we could customize these spell menus to minimize the amount of spells we have on screen, but regardless of these problems I personally have, at least they don't bother to limit the game and they always want you to feel free in their combat somehow. As much as I was having fun with the gameplay, I do want to point out that there was also another missed opportunity again with how they didn't really implement stealth. As I played with the game more, I noticed how I was able to parkour and take down multiple enemies fast. It's weird how they made a mechanic that notifies you if you're safe or if you're seen. They even added how enemies will build up to a certain awareness if you're seen. I saw so much potential how they could have added another layer to its combat where you could be quick and stealthy when engaging with its gameplay loop. The way how you could just parkour naturally and fly across the map while doing stealth takedowns is something I can envision what this game can do. They even have some stealth abilities where you could temporarily blind the enemies or literally vanish from them in thin air. I really do believe that the game does feel rushed to a certain extent where it didn't seem like they accomplished what they wanted to do initially. Happens a lot in game development, and it's not just this team. I already know that they offered a lot in its combat, and it would have been better if there were actual more layers to it from what all the things I just suggested. With the DLC that was released in May 2023, I was genuinely impressed on how it was designed. We don't necessarily have the same combat compared to its base game, and its combat is a bit more simplified, but it allowed the game designers to complement the levels and mechanics well for the player. I found myself much more engaged as soon as I unlocked all the abilities, which was by the end game for the DLC. It pretty much had the same pacing as base game where the abilities locked behind the story progression, but the end game levels gave me a perspective on how the team creates their combat. Although there were simple mechanics implemented for your playable character, they did add a new tag team mechanic where it helps to do much more damage with your party member, but it's also a way to create an opening in boss fights. I found the bosses to have much more depth than the base game bosses, and it really felt like I was playing a Final Fantasy boss. If we really had more of this for the base game, it would have been absolutely wild to experience. I do believe that the boss fights needed more mechanics implemented into these fights, which the DLC did. The achievement of having success in staggering the bosses or enemies or figuring out how to approach the fight properly gave me satisfaction while seeing flashy effects by activating a party attack on the enemies. Another thing to point out was how minimal the combat abilities were, so the menu was much more easy to cycle through, or how easy it was to navigate through the weapon wheel menu. Although it isn't the solution I necessarily wanted with how the menu is, it does give an insight that maybe less is more for abilities, as they could focus on giving better level designs that can complement the gameplay well with each other. The only big negative of its DLC is that it's about 2 to 3 hours long with no replay value. As someone who was thoroughly enjoying the gameplay, it would have been nice to have a bit more, especially for the original price it was given. Currently it's $12 in the PlayStation Store, but I have no clue if the price was higher back then. I know plenty of DLCs RPGs that have that exact same price range, and they give much more in its gameplay. They did add additional content for base game, which is post-game content of fighting the last enemies and bosses of the DLC. This is the only replay value you could get out of it, but it is nice for those who want more challenging fights that can push the combat to its limits. Regardless of the flaws, the game is enjoyable with the gameplay loop that is given to you that can push the current combat and enables the player to be stylistic with its gameplay beyond your expectations. The DLC even adds upon this by putting challenging fights in your base game, creating more replay value to those who enjoy the combat. I really do appreciate Luminous Studio creating a fun game with an interesting narrative. I could see that the effort is put in throughout the game and their DLC. It's such a shame that a game like this was torn to pieces by a tough audience that didn't want to see it succeed. There was clearly a game that had systems and still felt like an RPG with the amount of length it had, the grind, the pacing, the builds you could have, and how you could approach enemies within combat, all within a reasonable amount of time to spend compared to many RPGs. After spending 40 plus hours in this game, I could say for sure that this isn't the worst game that the internet said it was. I don't think it's necessarily a great game with the amount of flaws that are presented, but the concept and execution of this game is there. Since it exists, this is a unique game of its own with what the team has delivered, and like what I've mentioned before, their gameplay is much more creative than many other recent AAA games we have gotten in these past few years. I admire when studios go to achieve something different, and it should be celebrated by everyone that they bothered to do something unique rather than making it safe. I do hope to see more unique concepts coming from Square Enix, because not too long ago this team had to merge back with Square Enix instead of them being their own studio. Although it wasn't necessarily because of the backlash and sales of Forspoken, I do hope they don't take the feedback too literally from the audience and keep sticking with their mind on being creative. Also, you may be asking me, would you want a sequel for Forspoken? My answer is hell yeah. The amount of traits it has to create better gameplay for the sequel is literally right in front of us. If they weren't gonna create a sequel, then I hope Square Enix carries these gameplay traits to another game and improves upon it. It would be a shame to not use this element of gameplay again. This wraps up my critique on Forspoken. I hope everyone enjoyed this video and found this insightful. Also, if you're new to the game, feel free to comment your initial impressions about this. I'm quite curious how everyone feels about this game, especially how we're kind of past this game now. Remember to drop a like and subscribe if you haven't yet. Any support to the channel is very much appreciated. I hope to see you all again in future videos and streams as we give different games a chance. I'm finally signing off after this 35+ minute video, so thank you guys, whoever has reached up until this point, and I hope you have a good day. Expect to see more content in the future, and peace. I'm out.